Good morning, church. It's good to be with you. My name is Aaron Zenz. I'm going to be bringing the message this morning, and we've been in a series where we are diving into this book called The Story. And what the story does is it gives us an idea of the overarching large narrative that's found in Scripture, and it does so by taking the specific individual stories, stringing them all along in chronological order, and we can see as God is working in the lives of these small stories, they're actually working together, like I said, to paint one big picture, one large story. And today we are in chapter 11. Chapter 11 covers the first half of David's life. David's such an important figure in this overall larger narrative that it required 2 chapters to dig into his life. So significant, in fact, that he's not just important in the Old Testament, but his significance is weaved all through the New Testament. We see when Jesus shows up on the scene, David is right there in mind and on everybody's tongue. On the very first page, if we were to open up to the New Testament in here, on the very first page of the New Testament, Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, reads like this: the record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David. So in the first sentence, before you're even able to take a second breath, David's name is already on our lips. Before we ever hear Jesus referred to as the Son of God or the Son of Man, he is referred to as the Son of David. That's how important David is. And you might say, well, that's a genealogy. Sure, David's name is going to show up in a list. Well, if we look at the narrative starts a few verses later in chapter 1, verse 18. And by verse 20, just 3 verses later after the narrative starts, we hear again David's name, where the angel comes to Joseph and says, Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife. So again, as soon as the story part of Matthew takes off, David is on everybody's lips. That's at the beginning of the New Testament. What if we turn to the end, the very last page of the New Testament? In Revelations 21, verse 16, Jesus pops up right before the book closes. The whole Bible is done. Jesus pops up with one final word. So these are the last words that Jesus gives us. The last thing Jesus wants us to know. And the last thing Jesus ever said that people heard in the Bible was, I, Jesus, have sent my angel to you to give you this testimony for the churches. I am the root and offspring of David and the bright and morning star. So in Jesus's final words, David was on his lips. And we see that David pop up so many ways all throughout the New Testament. In fact, when Paul is talking about the gospel, he says, if I have to boil the gospel down, the good news about Jesus to just its core, here's what I think is the most important things about the gospel. And Paul says in 2 Timothy 2:8, he says, remember, Jesus Christ, raised from the dead, descended from David. This is my gospel. Right? So in Paul's mind, the 2 most important things about Jesus is he was descended from David and he was raised from the dead. That's how significant David is. So we're going to find out, why is David so significant? How does he loom so large in everything that's going to happen in the rest of our narrative? To do that, we're going to look at we're going to focus on 2 verses from our reading this week. The first is found in 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 14. This is when Samuel is coming to King Saul to tell him that his time as king is over. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people, because you have not kept the Lord's command. And then the second verse is in chapter 16, verses 6 and 7. And this is when David shows up at the house of Jesse to find this new king. And all of the sons start coming in. And it says, when they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. The Lord said to Samuel, don't consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So both of these verses talk about the heart, David having a heart after God's own heart. and the fact that God doesn't look at the outward appearance, but he looks at the heart, right? So that's the lens we're going to look at this story of David through, of what's going on the outside versus what's going on the inside. So, of course, we all know the big, exciting event that happens in the first half of David's life is the showdown between David and Goliath. So we're going to take a look at that. We're going to take a look at the road that got us there. But primarily, that story is not about contrasting David and Goliath, as we may tend to have looked at it in the past. No, it's primarily serves to show the difference, not between David and Goliath, little guy versus big guy, or armor versus a sling. No, there is a contrast, but we're going to look mostly at the difference between Saul and David. All of these stories serve to highlight the difference between what was going on inside of Saul and what was going on inside of David. So that's what we're going to take a look at. And we're going to go all the way back, and we're going to compare these two guys in different situations, starting with why they were chosen in the first place. Saul was chosen to be king. David was chosen to be king. Why were they chosen? For very different reasons. For Saul, it was the people of Israel said, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, right? So Israel said when they wanted a king, when they got Saul, Saul was there because they said, we want to look like them, right? So were they mostly concerned about the inside or the outside? Right? This is something on the outside. They're looking around at what they see all around us, and they say, we want that too. All right, so they were focused on the outside. How about the motivation for picking David? Well, Samuel said it was because the Lord has sought out a man who is after his own heart, and he has appointed him ruler over his people. All right, so why was David chosen? Because God was saying, I want his heart to look like mine. Right? So does that have to do with the outside or the inside? That's the inside, right? So right off the bat, these two kings were chosen for very different reasons. All right, well, let's move forward to their anointings when they get crowned king. Those are also very different stories. When the story of when Saul gets presented to be the king of Israel, the description is that he was a head taller than any of the others there. Samuel said, there is no one like him among all the people. So apparently Saul was tall. Saul was a tall guy. So much it says all the people. I don't know. Is he the tallest guy in all of Israel, or is that just kind of, making an exaggerated statement? I don't know. Maybe he was. But what we know is physically he was impressive, and he impressed Samuel. But inwardly, he was not where he needed to be. And we actually see this represented in a couple of things that we actually witness. Where when we first see Saul, where is he? He's lost his donkeys. He is wandering around, going to city to city to city to area looking for these lost donkeys. They're not where they're supposed to be. He's not where he's supposed to be. And he never finds them. This whole time, he cannot find his donkeys. He's clueless. And then when it's time for for Samuel to say, here's your guy, here's the king. They take a look and they're looking for him and they're like, where, Saul, where are you? I don't see you. And he was hiding. He was hiding in the baggage. And they had to pull him out. So literally Saul was not where he was supposed to be. Also, I think we can see that looking later on, his heart, what's going on inside him, is not where it needs to be as well. How about David? David outwardly was not impressive. He was insignificant. When Samuel shows up to Jesse's house to find the new king, David isn't even there. Jesse didn't even bother to call him. The 7 other brothers that David had, they were there, and they start calling them one by one. Eliab, Abinadab, Shammah. And then I think it's hilarious the way the Bible tells us. And he's like, and then, like all the rest of them came too. Eventually all 7 of them came by. And I think that's hilarious. Like we get the names of the first 3, and then everybody else is just sort of like lumped together. And then, yeah, there was a bunch more too. And David is at the end of that list. He's at the end of that list of lumping people together, not even important enough to know his name. Makes me think of like with our own kids when we started having photo albums. Poor rest of the kids. Isaac gets like one or two photo albums all of his own, and then it moves to Gracie, and then okay, there's less, and then it moves to Lily. To eventually, it's like, do we even have any photos of our younger kids? Like, it's not, you don't do that on purpose, but that's just sort of the way it works, and that's apparently the way it worked in Jesse's house. In fact, in the story, we don't even find out David's name until everything is all done. I'll read it right to you. It's kind of interesting. So it says, are these all the sons you have? And he says, well, they're still the youngest. They're still the littlest. He's tending the sheep. Doesn't even bother to mention his name. So Samuel says, send for him. We won't sit down till he arrives. So he sent for him and brought him in. The Lord said, rise and anoint him. This is the one. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. We don't even know his name yet. If you were reading this story for the first time, you wouldn't even have a clue who we're talking about until after it's all done. And then it says, and from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. First time David's name appears in the story in the whole Bible is even after, the significant calling of him. That's how insignificant everybody else kind of looked at him as. So that was David's appearance on the outside, but inwardly, what was going on? David was right where he needed to be. When they said, where is the youngest? Jesse knew. He's out tending the sheep. And was he there? He was there. They went out and they got him. Why was he there? He was there because he was obedient to his father. That was the job that Jesse had given David. Everybody else is in the house. And this is a thankless job, right? David's not important enough to be in the house when this big event is going on. He's kind of relegated. He's set aside off in the fields, but David is there. And rather than being bitter about that, he, tends to his work very with excellence and does his best at it. Uses his time wisely out there. He could have just felt set aside, but God was doing something that nobody else could see. Not even David could see this. Do we think David ever dreamed that he would have a chance of being a king? No way. But as a shepherd, God was preparing him for things that were ahead. We think about the song that David wrote later on, Psalm 23. Think about this in terms of David out there in the fields, living these things out as this little shepherd boy. He's out there taking care of the sheep, and as he's out there, he's got a lot of time on his hands. He's alone. Rather than being frustrated and bitter, he starts turning his thoughts to God. The Lord is my shepherd, and I shall have no wants. All of these troubles, he's taking care of me. Oh, let's not get bitter. Let's not get upset. He makes me to lie down in green pastures, the same way I'm doing this for my sheep. I'm leading them beside the water, and he leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod, your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me. Do you see an interesting thing that's happened here? David starts out, the language has changed. In the first half of the psalm, David's saying he. And then partway through, there's a switch, and he starts saying you, right? So as David intentionally turns his thoughts to God, he meets God. David knows God, and God knows him. And in this intimacy, worship breaks out. David starts singing songs to God. David made a choice, a deliberate choice of how he was going to spend his time. He didn't get bitter. No, he turned to God, and God used that. Right? David, he cultivated that inside himself. David is, while he's out there praising, he's becoming a songwriter. And he wasn't because he was aspiring to do something with this later on. He never thought that was going to be anywhere outside of just him and his sheep. It just flows out naturally of this personal worship that's happening out in the fields. So is David thinking about outside or inside? Right? That's the inside stuff that's going on. His worship is breaking out inside of his heart. But guess what? God uses that, right? David didn't know God was going to. But later on, when Paul is kind of having his meltdown, where he's all, emotionally all over the place, there's somebody who says, I've seen a son of Jesse that plays the harp. God is with him, right? So the stuff that David was just doing, in private for the sake of his own soul and his relationship with God, Somebody saw that. That was David's reputation of what was inside him. And David got invited to the palace. He gets to see, before he becomes a king, he gets to see what palace life is like, who all the players are, how running a kingdom works, what works good, what works bad, right? Why? Because God had prepared him, and then when the door was open, David was ready, right? So David was exactly where he needed to be. When the call came for Saul to have, the need of somebody playing music, David didn't scramble to say like, oh, let me see if I can figure that out real quick. No, he was already perfectly positioned to step into what God had planned for him. All right, so let's move on. Let's take a look at their responses, the difference of the response of Saul and David toward Goliath. All right, so what on the outside? How did Saul look? Well, we've already said Saul was a tall guy, possibly the tallest guy in all of Israel. Seems like he would have been a great match for the tallest guy in the Philistines. Now, still, he was a little bit, not quite as high, but if you're going to pick a guy, seems like he would be a good contender. Plus, that was the whole reason that the Israelites wanted him in the first place. When they were telling Samuel why they wanted a king, they said, we want to be like all the other nations with a king who will go out before us and fight our battles, right? So that was the outward expectation, is this guy's going to go fight for us. Inwardly, where was Saul? Saul was out of step. So here's my question. Here's what I've been thinking about. Could anybody have just gone up and defeated Goliath? I don't know. I don't think so. A lot of times that's the way the story is presented. It's like God was going to win this. We just needed a body there. We just needed somebody to step in that was brave enough, and God was going to use them, right? So if Saul would have just stepped up, would he have won? I don't know. I don't think there's necessary. I looked. There's no verses that give that indication. I think that's something that we bring to the text. In fact, we see quite the opposite. Twice, Saul has been told, before this scene with Goliath, twice Saul has been told, your kingdom is not going to endure. You have not kept the commandments of God that God gave you. So you are done. You're done, Saul. God's not with you anymore. So was God going to protect just anybody who stepped up? The very next time we see Saul in a battle, Saul dies, right? Saul does. So God didn't protect Saul in that battle. Why do we think God would have protected Saul in this battle? Before this episode, we see Saul battling all over the place. He's going and he's attacking these guys, and he's going and attacking these guys. He's fighting these battles. He's winning all these battles, but he's doing it in the wrong way. He's keeping the spoils when he's not supposed to. And so God says, you're done. We don't see Saul in another battle until when we do, he dies. He dies in his very first battle after that. All the battles we see between Goliath and that one years later, when there's a need for a battle, Saul sends David out to fight those battles, while Saul stays back at the palace with the spear in his hand, right? When we do see Saul out with his armies, we don't see them battling. We see him out hunting David down. We see him out hunting David down. We never see him fighting. We just see him chasing David. And actually, the only reason he wasn't killed in those situations is because David wouldn't do it. There was twice where David had a chance to kill him, and he says, no, I'm not going to do it, right? So I don't know that Saul was in the right position to go and fight against Goliath. How about David? Outwardly, they were very mismatched. Saul said to David, when he looked at him, when David came up, he's like, you're not able to go fight. You're just a youth. He didn't even ask him any questions. He didn't say, why do you think you can fight? He just said, like, I know what's going on with you. You can't do this. When Goliath saw David, he saw that he was a little more than a boy, and he despised him, right? Everybody, is this looking at what's going on inside David, or looking at what's going on outside David? They're looking at the outside, right? But inwardly, what was going on, David was ready. David, when he comes up to Saul, notice what David doesn't say. He doesn't just say, like, well, God's going to give anybody the victory. You just got to trust in him. No, what reason does David say he can go fight? He says, because your servant has already killed the lion. He's already killed the bear. And I will be able to kill Goliath in the exact same way. The Lord rescued me from the hand of the lion and the hand of the bear. And so the Lord is going to rescue me from this Philistine in the exact same way, right? So he points to the skill that God gave him. He doesn't say, like, I can do this because I'm so cool. He's saying, I know God has prepared me for this. I've seen it in action. I have evidence that God is able to use me this way. When did he learn this? When he was out in those fields, when he'd been set aside. He's using his time wisely to figure out how to protect these sheep that his father had called him to look after. So he's learning how to use a stone. He's learning how to, protect the ones that are under his watch. He was training just for the sake of his sheep. He wasn't doing that for any other reason, but God saw David is ready. He didn't just see, God was working this out. God had prepared David for the thing he was going to call him to do. So it's not one or the other. It's not like, oh, I've got all these skills, and it's not, oh, God can make this happen, so anybody can do it. No, it's both. It's these two things working together. It's the skills God has given him, plus David's trust in the God who had given him those skills. I have a story. This is a true story, a real life story. I'm going to change some details of the story to protect the players involved. So I'm not even going to mention a name, and I'm going to change the occupation. All right. So we're going to say that this guy is an electrician. There's an electrician I know who had a heart for God, who wanted to please God, and so he said, I am willing to go wire your houses, right? If your house has a need, come to me. I will take care of it. What were his qualifications? His qualifications were, I'm going to pray ahead of time. We've got the Bible. The Bible has everything for life and godliness, right? So we're going to trust God that this is going to go really well. What did we see play out in this guy's life? All of the houses that he wired were burning down. In fact, his wife came once to a friend and confided, like, could you really pray for my husband? Satan is really trying to discourage him right now. He is helping with all of these houses, and every single one of them is burning to the ground. So Satan really must, be at work in those houses. And he's just starting to get really discouraged. So pray, that he'll stick with it, that he'll keep in there. And when I heard this story, I thought, well, there does seem to be a common factor in all of these houses burning to the ground. I don't know that it's necessarily Satan is the primary suspect, that he's just, kind of magically making all these bad things happen. There is another common factor. The other common factor is this guy who doesn't know how to do electrical work. I think rather than pray that he wouldn't get discouraged and would plow forward and keep doing this, I think we should say, hold up, maybe you shouldn't be wiring houses, right? So it's not one or the other. It's not like, oh, we can just do whatever we want because God's going to take care of it. And it's not like, oh, I've got all these skills, so, things are going to go well. It's like we look at where God has placed us, what God has prepared us to do. And if we see God using us in certain ways, then when God opens the door, it's like, yeah, I think I'm the guy that God has prepared to step into that place, right? So are you somebody who is really, loves cooking, is great with food? God opens the door in a food ministry. It's like, hey, maybe this is the time and place for you. You don't want me being in charge of meals, right? Everybody's going to get food poisoning if I try to step in there and just pray ahead of time that it goes well. Where has God put me? God has put me in a place where I, for years, have written for kids, have interacted with kids, worked with kids. I have a lot of kids myself, right? And we've seen, some good fruit that comes out of that. So when a door opens up where there's a chance to work with kids in a ministry area, it's like, maybe this is a place that God has prepared you to step into this, right? You don't want like some grumpy old dude or lady who hates kids to, come in and fill that role and just pray ahead of time that it'll go well, right? I think that's a principle that we see here in the life and the story of David. All right, so could anybody have done it? I don't think so. I think God had called specifically David for this task. All right, so what happens next? So they're like, all right, David, you go out there. What does Saul do? He dresses him up in his own tunic, in a coat of armor, a helmet, a sword. Again, where's Saul's focus? On the inside? Nope, he's still thinking about the outside, right? Let's dole you up. I think it's also really interesting to note that he didn't just go grab, a suit of armor, a tunic, a sword. He's specifically giving him his stuff. Now, why is he doing that? Right? You might think like, oh, that's so nice of Saul. He wants to give him his very fine. He wants to give him the best. I don't think that's what's going on. Again, Saul is all about appearances. He's all about saving face, right? So if David is going to go out and win this battle, he wants people to know, well, he used my sword, right? It reminds me of that scene in Back to the Future 3, right? Where Marty is going to go out and he's going to, do a similar thing, a one-on-one showdown. And the guy comes up to him and he says, I would like you to have this new Colt Peacemaker and gun belt free of charge. He says, I want everybody to know that the gun that shot Buford Tanner was a Colt Peacemaker. And Marty is like, wow, thanks. And he's like, of course, you understand that if you lose, I'm taking them back, right? So I think that's what's going on here with Saul. He's saying, well, if David dies, no skin off my nose. But if he's actually going to go and win, I want him using my stuff, right? I want to be a part of the glory that's taken place there. So David says, nope, I don't need this stuff. I can't use this stuff. So he goes out and it says he grabs 5 stones and he puts them in the pouch of his shepherd bag. I think that's another really interesting detail. Why does it specifically say shepherd bag? Later on when it's talking about the bag, it just says bag. Right here it says it's his shepherd bag. Why? Because God did not need David to become somebody new, right? God had already prepared him as a shepherd, right? And in that identity, in that training, God was using everything that God had already given David in this situation. All right, so I think that's an encouragement for us. I think sometimes there's a hindrance when we think about serving God, that we think we have to I got to become somebody different. I got to go get, I got to change. I got to do this. I got to be somebody else in order to serve God. And so we don't do it. I think a much wiser way to approach ministry and serving God is, what are you doing right now? What are you already doing? What do you love? What are your passions? Where have you seen yourself successful in things? What are your skills? You may think that you've gained these skills, but maybe chances are God has been preparing you by giving you these skills. Give him credit for that. And then when a door opens and you see, hey, that's a place where I would plug in well, then by all means, go do that. Now, if you have a passion and you're not good at it, go get the training for it, right? That's a fine thing to do. When Paul, after he was converted, he spent over a decade hanging out with the apostles, getting the training and learning before he ever went out on his missionary journey, right? So it's okay to go out and get the training, but tie it into what you're already doing and what God has made you and where you see skills and where you see successes, rather than just be like, maybe I'll try that, right? All right, moving on. Here's our last point. What were their responses to each other? That's how they responded to Goliath. What were David and Saul's responses to each other? Well, after the battle, after David killed Goliath, there is this song that people start singing. Saul has killed his thousands. David has killed his tens of thousands. It's a catchy little ditty, so much so that there's later on in the book we find out that there's people in other kingdoms that know this song. They're like, hey, I know that song about you, right? So apparently it's a real earworm. But this makes Saul angry, right? And so how does anger, is that outside or is that inside? That's inside. How does Saul deal with the anger that's inside of him? Does he deal with it? What's in it? No, the problem is everybody else, right? Problem is David. So the very next David, Saul takes his spear and tries to pin David to the wall, right? That's an outward. He's trying to solve a problem outwardly that is located inwardly. Then Saul gets afraid. how does he deal with the fear that's in him? He sends David away. He's like, well, I just don't want David anywhere near me. He's trying to take care of an inward problem by doing something outward. So he sends him out as his campaign manager. He's like, all right, you go out to all these battles where I don't have to see you. Does that fix the problem? No, because then David's really successful, and then Saul gets even more afraid. Later on, Saul comes to some officers, and now he's really paranoid. All of this, by trying to eliminate his perceived problems externally, it leads to this paranoia inside him. He goes to his officers and he says, "You're all conspired against me. Nobody is concerned about me. My son has stirred up David to lie in wait against me. You knew he was running away from me. You have taken sides with David." Ahimelech is like, where is this coming from? Like, out of all of your servants, David is the most highly respected. Don't let the king make these accusations. And Saul's response is, okay, you and your father's whole family are going to die. And he slaughters them. Scores of people, dozens and dozens of people. So there was this paranoia. Everybody's against me. You're against me. You're against me. You're thinking bad things about me. There was this, he saw everything in terms of sides. You're on David's side. Who's on my side? Nobody's on my side. Nobody cares about me. He's paranoid, right? This is what Saul really sees. He truly, honestly sees this when he looks around. There's something, this fear inside of David is changing his perception of reality, right? And it had bad consequences. So, but I think we can see what Saul saw had more to do with what was inside him than what was actually inside David, right? And David was filled with fear, and it changed his reality of what was going on with others. In fact, we see this a lot with David. As I don't know if you picked up on this. This happens all the time with David. When he first goes to fight, or he doesn't even go to fight. He goes to bring food to his brothers because his father has asked him to do that. So what's in David's heart? Just obedience. I'm here to bring you guys some food. Eliab sees him, and it says he burns with anger inside, and he says, "Why have you come here? I know how conceited, arrogant, proud you are, how wicked your heart is. You came down just to watch the battle." Now, that perception that Eliab has, does that have more to do with what's going on inside Eliab, or more about what's going on inside with David? It has nothing to do with David, right? David says that. He's like, what did I do? Right? But Eliab has this anger inside, and it changes the way he sees other people, right? It changed his sense of reality. Same thing happened later on with Michal, David's wife. So after David's king and he brings the ark back to Jerusalem, he's dancing and praising God. And his heart is, again, he's somebody whose heart breaks out in worship with God. He's not thinking about anybody around him. He's just worshiping a God, on his own, but in the public square. And the verses say, Michal saw David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. Those are the words. In her heart, she despised him. And so the next time she sees David, she says, how the king of Israel distinguishes himself today, disrobing before the slave girls and servants. So she's like, I know why you did that. You did that to show off in front of the others. Now, her perception of that, did they have more to do with what was going on inside of her, or more to do with what was actually going on inside of David? No, she was filled with contempt, and it altered her reality of what was going on with others. What was David's godly response? It was before the Lord, and I'm going to continue to celebrate before the Lord. His godly response was, I'm not going to change what I'm doing just because of her perspective, because of her messed up view. Now, here's the awesome thing about David and his heart is he looks inside, and he's very in tune with his insides, and he's like, I know what's going on inside of me. Because later on, this isn't this week, this is Pastor John's week, next week, when somebody comes to him and says, hey, heads up, God isn't pleased with you. David looks inside and he says, you're right. There is something bad inside of me. So it's not that David just dismisses things all the time. No, he knows his inside. He looks, he He is very attuned to what's going on inside him in a way that Michal and Saul and Eliab didn't. David does have that ability to look at his insides and to see where he's at. So what was David's response to Saul through all of these trials? Well, David's godly response when Saul is after him, we see the example in Psalm 59. This is an example of something that David wrote when he was in that situation. He says, "Deliver me." He's praying to God, "Deliver me, you be my fortress, you are my strength. I watch for you, I will sing of your strength. In the morning, I will sing of your love." Right? So what David does, when he's even given the opportunity twice to eliminate the outward threat. He could have killed Saul twice, but he doesn't. He's like, I know the problem isn't just on the outside. What you're more concerned with, God, is what's going on inside of me. So help me to trust you. I am afraid. I am angry. I have all these problems. And he turns to God. And by the end of his prayer to God, in this radical honesty and openness of his needs, he breaks out in worship. I will sing of your... First, he's praying for God to be his strength, and then he trusts that it's going to come. I will sing of your strength. In the morning, I will sing of your love. He remembers all the true things about God, and his heart turns and changes and moves to worship. Where Saul thinks all the problems are outside of him, inside, it turns to paranoia. When David deals with what's inside of him, it turns to praise, right? So there we go. Now, again, that's the specific small pictures. We're also, in this book, we're looking at how this ties into the big picture. Jesus is coming, right? And Jesus, we know, is the true king. Both Saul and David fell short, right? All these things, God makes all these things in the world that serve as pictures that point to Jesus, right? We know that marriage is a picture that points to Jesus. We know that the relationship between a father and a son is a picture that points to God the Father and God the Son, right? Kings are pictures that point to Jesus. If you have a good marriage and a good father and a good king, then you are going to be able to see ways that compares to our good God. If you have a bad spouse and a bad father and a bad king, it still points to Jesus, but what it does is it contrasts with who Jesus. Aren't we glad that Jesus isn't that way? So as we look at the life of David, we see that he was a man after God's own heart. And yeah, David had failures, but more than any other king that Israel ever had, David is the one who reflects and points to Jesus in the most amazing ways. How does he do that? All right, let's make a list. Let's make a list of things that we see in both the life of David and the life of Jesus. All right, here are some parallels. The story starts out in a field where there is a shepherd keeping watch over his flocks. There's a messenger that arrives with news of a brand new king. Where do we find this king? We go to Bethlehem, right? So the Messiah means anointed one, right? The one who's going to be anointed. The Messiah in Bethlehem does not have the outer appearance that you would expect. The current king is jealous and paranoid, wants to save his own reign, and so he seeks to destroy this young up-and-coming king. And as he's trying to do that, he kills a whole bunch of innocents along the way in his pursuit to take him out. The king-to-be goes into hiding until the current threat is gone. Again, this king is unlikely. He's unassuming. He has the heart of a shepherd. Why was this new king called in the first place? Why do we need him? Because of the first man's failures. God provides a replacement to do what the first man who was appointed to rule could not or did not do. This coming king eventually engages in a one-on-one showdown in which there is one person who represents everybody. And if he wins, then everyone wins. All the stakes are put on this one guy. And with his victory, everyone benefits and everyone has life. This is a story that we said it starts in Bethlehem. Where does this story end? It ends in Jerusalem. The same way where we see Jesus eventually go to Jerusalem and he dies there. And in the end of our story today, we see David heading to Jerusalem, bringing the ark back to Jerusalem. That is crazy. That is a crazy amount of parallels. The thing that amazes me as we go through this week after week and we're looking at the stories in this book is that would be amazing if there was just one life that had this many parallels. But we see this in life after life after life after life after life. All these people who parallel Jesus so perfectly. Like, the chances that you could orchestrate that to make your life match somebody else's life, one person is pretty outstanding, especially when most of this stuff is happening when you're a baby and you have no control over it. That's amazing. But to have it be like dozens and dozens of these Christ figures that parallel and point to Jesus, I would say, it sounds to me like that is something that goes beyond normal, and that is something supernatural, right? That is a clear sign that as God is working in the lives of people here in this lower story, that there is an upper story going on that is so significant and touches all of these lives, all of these stories. And we have, and you and I, in our lower stories, we have the opportunity to have our lives point to God, point to Jesus, to mirror who God is and all the amazing things that he has done, just like we see in the life of David.